Hello, welcome to Drugs Unwrapped with me, Rob. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Judy Ryan. Judy from Melbourne. Yes. Welcome to the UK. How's your trip so far?
It's been absolutely lovely. It's lovely to get some sun today, Rob. But the weather here in Cardiff has been very like Melbourne. We get 4 seasons in one day, and that suits me just fine.
Yeah, lovely. So you're actually doing a Churchill fellowship, which we'll get on to a little bit later. One of the big reasons I wanted to speak to you is around drug consumption rooms. I know they're referred to different terms throughout the world, really. But a drug consumption room is essentially within your area of residence.
Correct.
So I kind of want to go back, really. So it was 2018, was it June, July 2018?
June 30, 2018.
Okay, so that's when a consumption room was established.
It opened in our community, that's right.
So what was going on before that then? So what was the reason why that area was essentially identified as the place where was it the first in Australia?
No, it wasn't the first in Australia. The first in Australia was in Sydney, in King's Cross. The facility there opened in 2001, and the one in Sydney came on the back of a drug summit in that city of Sydney, and they decided that injecting drug use and overdose deaths was an issue of serious public health concerns. So they opened that facility in 2001, and it was the only one in Australia for 17 years. So I live in Melbourne, which is in the state of Victoria, and the area that I moved to is Richmond, which is right on the edge of the city of Melbourne. Some of your viewers may be familiar with the Melbourne Cricket Ground or the MCG.
Yeah.
So it's actually only about a 20-minute walk from the MCG,
okay,
and a 30-minute walk from the centre of Melbourne. I lived there when I was a university student many, many years ago, and there was a drug market there then. That was in the late 1970s. And so it's always been one of those inner city areas where people use drugs. And one of the reasons, or 3 of the reasons why that is the case, was that drugs are illegal. They're illicit substances, and people use them in areas where they can get access to the drugs quickly and use them privately, so they aren't prosecuted by police. So we have lots of inner city laneways with outcrops of bluestone where people can buy their drugs and move into laneways and use their drugs without being seen. There's also a fantastic public transport network of buses, trams and trains, so people can get in and out of the area very easily. And the third thing is that it was a very bustling shopping strip with restaurants and milk bars and little service areas, so people could, with their drugs, could mix in with the throng. So it was a really a very valuable area for people to buy their drugs, but also for people to sell the drugs. So the drug market had been quite active there for some years, and as I said, I lived there in the late 1970s, and that was evident then. But it did grow over the years, and I raised my family in regional Victoria, up near the New South Wales Victoria border. And when my children left home, they went off to university and to do other things. My husband and I decided to move back to the city because we had relations and people there. And we moved back to that area because it's a pretty groovy, funky, lots of really interesting places to eat and visit, and it's close to the city. And I knew that there was a drug issue, a drug market there, and this was in 2012. But that didn't worry me. I thought, well, look, people have been using drugs there for years, that's fine. The thing was, I'd never actually lived in a drug market as it was.
Okay.
And it was very confronting to live there as a resident with people buying drugs and rushing to use them, seeing them collapsed in laneways. Often there would be ambulances blocking laneways when somebody had found somebody collapsed. So the sound of sirens was common. And it was just the shock of seeing human beings collapsed as they were. And I'm not a medical person. I'm just a resident, and I would go shopping or go out with friends, or would be coming home from work and be confronted with what I considered was a major public health crisis. This went on for me personally for 4 years, so from 2012 to 2016. And in that time, you get to know people using drugs in your area. You're familiar with them. You might even know their name. You chat with them. And I never felt afraid. I never felt I was under threat. I was just concerned about their well-being. In July 2016, I was coming home on a Sunday afternoon with my shopping, and there was a young man collapsed at my back gate that led into a laneway next to my house, or alleyway, and I recognised him. He was probably in his early 20s, and he was collapsed. And I dropped my shopping, I ran to him, I checked his pulse, he was still alive, rang ambulance, stayed with him until the ambulance came. But it was really my tipping point. I decided that I'd had enough of this clear crisis, and there just didn't seem to be anything happening in terms of the authorities. There was no information to residents really about what was going on, and I went into my house and I said to my husband, John, this is outrageous. They should do something about this. And he said, who's they? So I think he probably regrets that he said that because it's now 8 years later, and I've become very passionate about drug harm reduction, the fact that people who use drugs should not die from that, and they shouldn't be dying in public places. They should have somewhere safe to use those facilities, supervised. So that afternoon I Googled heroin deaths, dying, Australia, and it came up with the Sydney Medically Supervised Injecting Centre. Okay. I read it, and I read it again, and I was pretty blown away with what was on offer there, and I thought that sounds like something we probably need in this community.
Yeah. When you said, like, come 2016, was it, where it's like your tipping point really? I get a sense that your anger was more towards like the authority. I'm not saying necessarily by putting words in your mouth really in terms of anger, but that kind of frustration, I guess, more towards the authorities. Was it ever towards actually people who use substances, who actually use in that area at all, or was it more towards those who could actually kind of have that power to make that change?
It was really towards the authorities who clearly knew that this was an issue. I mean, you can't be having ambulances deployed to these areas and syringes without somebody knowing that this was happening and there were deaths in the street. I wasn't angry with the people using drugs. It was really clear to me that they were unwell.
Okay.
That this was not, and you could see people before they used the drugs, the sense of urgency, and then of course afterwards when they were in a state of nodding off, as they say. And if it was appropriate, I would always ask how people were take care. You shouldn't be here on your own, because if you inject on your own, it's deadly if there's not somebody coming past to find you. So no, I was never angry with them, with those people, because I just felt there's clearly an issue, something's wrong here. And I just felt to be injecting in a lonely laneway somewhere on a really hot day or a really cold afternoon is just not ideal. So that was why when I read about the facility in Sydney, the fact that people were supervised, they were treated without judgment, they were offered support, I really felt it was an evidence-based and very sensible approach to this issue.
It's quite a unique perception, really, in terms of what you had, I think. I think a lot of people, when they potentially see people who use drugs in their area, they may kind of have different viewpoints, really. So it's quite refreshing to hear in terms of how you felt about it, and even, like you said, to go out and kind of give that harm reduction advice, really, which, I think for a lot of people maybe outside of the fields, that may not necessarily occur too much to them.
Look, I mean, it's challenging. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this was always something that I felt thrilled about, or I feel I can understand why people would be very confronted and not know what to do, and in a way sometimes I felt like that too, but I also saw people as human beings. I mean, conversations I had with people, and once I knew them enough, I'd say, tell me your story, why are you here? And often they're just very human stories, and we're frail, we're fragile human beings. And I just felt that there was a need for something better than this, and especially in a beautiful city like Melbourne. It's a wealthy city, it's sophisticated, and yet there was this crisis happening, and I just didn't want that to happen on our watch. So that was really all it was. But I knew also it was connected to the fact that it was an inner city, grungy sort of area, which is part of the appeal.
Yeah.
So that's why people were attracted to that inner city hub, which is what I explained before. Yeah.
So when they were starting to put together the consumption room, like how much were you consulted on as like a resident in terms of it being going to be in that area? Is that something that was communicated quite a lot to you, or was there a bit of a gap really in terms of between the residents and those that were going to open and facilitate it?
When I decided that something should happen, they should do something, I really had to do a bit of market research. I had to work out, did anybody else care like I did? I knew my neighbour did, my husband obviously did, a few other people that I knew did. So an opportunity came about 3 months later where we were having inner city elections, local council, local government elections across Victoria and including in my area. So I decided to run as a candidate in the election as an independent candidate on the single issue of opening a medically supervised injecting facility in our community, like the one in Sydney.
Yeah.
Now it was a pretty crazy idea, but in many respects I really thought, look, an election will give me some indicator of what people thought, and by being an independent and only one issue, and nobody knew who I was, so they were just voting for that issue. So I thought I'd make it really clear, and if I got 23 votes, well, obviously nobody else cared much.
Yeah.
The result was quite the opposite, to the extent where I missed out on becoming a councillor by the smallest of votes right at the end of our preferential counting system, which is a different system in Australia. So some of the other councils were shocked. They said, you nearly got in. And to be honest, Rob, I'm really glad I didn't. because I didn't run for council to be a councillor. I ran to find out did people care, and they did. So it sort of gave me a mandate to actually take the next step, which was to gather residents to try and understand why they supported that facility, and to form a bit of a movement to advocate. So what happened during the campaign, the election campaign, was I met lots of people who said, absolutely, I've lived here for 10, 20, 25 years. This is the worst it's ever been. We absolutely need people to do something about it. So that was in October 2016. And so we formed a group, and by the following 12 months, we'd managed to activate interest in the authorities to announce the opening. So the facility was announced in October 2017, and then it opened the following 9 months later. But what we did, and I think it's really key to this whole discussion about supervised consumption rooms and the public, was I really underestimated how much other people cared, because you sort of think drugs and it's just people will be deterred, or they will have a negative view. You know, I was really shocked at how much people did have compassion for this issue. The other thing was, sort of like me, they were interested in a supervised consumption facility, but they didn't really know much about it. And all I'd done was read on Google about this one in Sydney. Yeah. So as soon as I got the votes that I did, I flew up to Sydney on my own and had a look at the facility, and it was just remarkable. It was so professional and calm, and the staff were amazing, the way they spoke about people who use drugs, the outcomes, the support that it had with people on the street. Like, it really confirmed that I was on the right track, because it was just a superb facility. But of course I didn't have any money or any support, but the Sydney staff, under the leadership of Dr. Marianne Jauncey, they provided me with pamphlets, with written material, quick take this, read that. They were extremely supportive, and when I went back to Melbourne with that information, I gathered a small group of people, and then we decided to run monthly forums at a local warehouse to educate people about what supervised injecting and harm reduction was. We had a film that Sydney loaned us that explained what it was. We had a guest speaker every month, so a police officer or an ambulance officer or someone from the drug court, a lawyer that used to care for people in the drug court, and said, we need to keep people out of the court system. We need for them to get care. Somebody from the media. We had a person who had recovered from or hadn't died of a heroin overdose because they'd used the Sydney facilities, who was a well-known comedian in Australia. So we started getting a real groundswell of support, and people were saying, yes, this is something we need. Getting back to your question, we were trying to connect with local politicians, and they weren't really interested in it. It was almost like we'd picked a bit of a scab, and they just really didn't want to go there. Yeah. Now, there was one politician who was quite different. She was an independent politician who totally supported what we were doing, and I didn't know her before I started the campaign. Her name was Fiona Patton, and Fiona was in the process of putting up a private members bill to Parliament in Victoria for a medically supervised facility in our area. So we came together then, and she was very supportive and helpful. But ultimately, it was about getting the groundswell of support within the community. That was really key.
Absolutely. If it's going to be in that area, then I think that's one of the priorities, isn't it? Really, in terms of that. When it was established then, what was the response of the local media? Were they all kind of on board with it, or was it fairly split? And I'm assuming, depending on which newspaper, for example, will have different response.
Yes.
I know that, but
Yes.
was in general, was it fairly positive that a facility was to be and was established?
It was interesting, and this is almost another podcast because it's about the media. The media is a very important player in this story. When we were campaigning for the facility in 2017, the local media was really supportive of it. And at the time, the Premier of our state, of Victoria, his name was Daniel Andrews. Daniel Andrews was against the facility being opened. And no, this won't be happening. It wasn't a policy that we took to the election. It won't happen. And the media was, particularly the Murdoch media, was very supportive, saying, well, Premier, look, people are dying in the streets. You must do something about it. We support the residents. How can you not make a decision about this this facility? It will save lives. Heroin's really cheap in Melbourne. People are dying. And we were shocked. In fact, one of the Murdoch reporters offered to speak at one of our community forums and said, this is how you manage the media. It was pretty sweet, actually. And then as soon as the Premier announced that his mind had been changed, there were 3 coroner's reports that said, yes, we need to, they recommended this facility open. One of the police came out, a retired police officer, said we should support it. The residents are saying we should support it. Once that mind was changed, there was a real flip in the media narrative, which was just breathtaking, to be honest. And when it opened in June 2018, really since then it's been pretty relentlessly against the facility. And look, as I said, it's almost another podcast. It's just fascinating, really. It was almost like the objection was to the Premier, not to the issue when we first started. But once the Premier changed his mind, the media didn't like the Premier, so they went after the drug den, as they called it.
Okay. So what's been the impact then on you in terms of, and obviously your neighbour and obviously your just your family as a whole since it's been established, compared to what it was like before?
Look, it's been a remarkable improvement. Australia has pretty strict rules on who can and cannot use a supervised consumption facility. For example, you can only inject, so you can't use drugs in any other way. You can't smoke or snort.
Okay.
That's.
Is there a need for that though in terms of smoking? Because I know some consumption rooms allow smoking. Is there a need for it?
Well, there's a growing need, and I suppose on this Churchill fellowship, and I'm travelling around to various cities, the whole drug market is changing. So what it was like 8 years ago when we were campaigning to what it is now, heroin was the major drug of use in Melbourne at that time. Things are changing. There's synthetic opioids, nitazines are in our marketplace. People are wanting to smoke meth, methamphetamine. So this is happening across many cities. So, but in answer to your question, so people often couldn't use the facility if they were under 18 or they were pregnant or, they wanted to use together. That was a problem. So there were still people who didn't want to use the facilities, and that's the way it goes. The improvement in the public amenity in terms of people injecting drugs was immediate. It was quite remarkable how quickly that changed. Then, of course, coronavirus really threw a spanner in the works, like it has for everybody, in terms of people just didn't want to wait to queue, so there was a lot more people pushing back into the laneways, so people went, because it was distancing, and they closed down. There are 20 booths in the facility in Richmond. They closed half of those, so that has caused issues, but in the main it is a lot better. I live probably about 400 metres from the facility. People who live really close to it, like across the road in streets nearby, it's very mixed. Some people say it's never been worse. Well, I would disagree with that, because there aren't the people collapsed in the street, there aren't the sirens, there aren't the road blockages from ambulances. I mean, that's just not happening. Other people say it's just wonderful to be able to walk out into our gardens and laneways, and there's just not somebody collapsed there. So there are different views, and I acknowledge that. I think one of the really important things in terms of community engagement, people have different views on the success or otherwise of these facilities. Some people will never approve of them. Others in the centre perhaps are more interested in being educated. Like, we have tours, you can take a tour of the facility. It answers a lot of questions. I think there's a lot of mystery around these facilities which require education, and I totally agree with that as well. And we really encourage people to go through the facility. So I think it's about understanding. Everybody's getting used to it, including the people who inject drugs. And some people will never go there, and other people just think it's wonderful. So there's no homogenous group with any residents or people who use drugs or police or anything. It's a bit of a moving feast. But in terms of the impact it's had on emergency services vehicles and crime in the area, Victoria Police has released the fact that there's been decreases in assaults, burglaries, car thefts from in around that particular area. So that's often not a fact reported in the media, but that's just the way it is. But yes, it's definitely been, I think, and many others think it's been a big improvement.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to ask you is obviously some of the main concerns the public have around a consumption room being established is that it kind of has that honeypot effect. So, more people who use drugs come to that area, more kind of drug-related crime and drug dealing. People say, well, dealers will hang out there, and also that you'll have, you'll still have people intoxicated on the streets. They'll go and use, and then they'll come out and they'll be intoxicated. Are those kind of concerns that you've seen that have actually come to fruition, or are they kind of just myths really that kind of are built by people who potentially are a bit more fearful around such facilities?
Look, if there's a few issues there. One is the honeypot effect. When the facility opened in June 2018, there was a requirement that it was professionally assessed. The data was overseen by an eminent professor of addiction in Australia, Professor Margaret Hamilton, and she had a panel of another two people on the panel, and they announced the Hamilton results in June 2020. So, and one of the key areas they looked at was the honeypot. And Margaret Hamilton said they spent a lot of time analysing the data regarding who was attending the facility, and she said there was no evidence of a honeypot effect. And they looked at postcodes, like where people came from to use the facility, which was exactly the same sort of areas where people were coming from before the facility opened. So it was a very busy drug market, drug using area before the facility opened. And it was one thing that she did emphasise. I did spend a lot of time looking at that data. So the answer is no. Drug dealing is an issue. I mean, we don't allow people to deal drugs in the facility in Australia, in either Sydney or Melbourne. And there are definitely people dealing outside the centre, but they have been dealing there for a long time too. Once again, it's just people, they buy their drugs in the main street, which is Victoria Street, or nearby where there was a needle exchange, and that's sort of where the drug dealing had been happening. So some would say it's worse, others would say it's pretty much the same. A couple of things about the alcohol. It's really interesting because right opposite the injecting room in Richmond is a school. We're about 30 metres from a primary school. And then sort of to complete a triangle is a hotel, which has been there for 100 plus years. So there is definitely alcohol in the area as well. So there's these three key facilities, the school, the pub and the injecting room. The injecting room is right next to the big local community health centre, which has been there for 50 years. So, and that was where the needle exchange was, which is why people would come there to get their syringes and then they would use nearby. So that was sort of why it was a key area for putting the facility. As internationally people know, you put the facility where the problem is.
Yep.
So it's a pretty busy area then. So you've got kids at the school. The school has about 260 kids enrolled. Then you've got the pub, and then you've got the injecting room. The parents at the school is another really important issue to consider. Once again, some parents just thought it was shocking and they've taken the kids out of the school. That's their absolute right to do that, for sure. Other parents say that, well, our kids were going to school there before the facility opened. They'd already seen people, collapse from drugs. The parents use that as an opportunity to explain to their children about issues to do with human being and social justice, etc. So, look, it really just depends on, I suppose, your view on these things. Ideally, it would be best if it wasn't there, but the reality was that's where it was already happening. And I have written a book about our campaign for the supervised injecting facility, and one of the voices that I was able to interview was some teachers who'd been there for years when the school first opened, and they said, look, there have been syringes in the sand pits and the playgrounds of the school for years and years and years. People,
wow.
It was because of the community health centre and the syringe exchange. There were already people there. Sometimes people would come out of the hotel and they were drunk and they were collapsed there too. So it was a pretty contested area in terms of substance abuse and use. And so, look, it's some parents think don't have a problem with it, and there's a lot of foliage around the school, so you can't see the injecting facility from the school. And there are other people that don't like it and have left the school. The interesting thing I should just tell you about the school, though, it is a very well-regarded school. It offers a Mandarin speaking, reading, learning program right from the early stages, and it's quite sought after. Okay. So a lot of people will come to that area to send their children to the school, even knowing there's the facility next door. So the school is a very reputable school that's sought after. So, look, I'm not saying everybody loves it, but there are a lot of people who don't have a problem with it being there.
So would you go back? Would you go back to pre-2018, or are you considering everything? Are you happy with how things are since the establishment of the DCR?
Oh, very. I think looking back at life in that community before that facility opened, it was just chaotic. It was tragic. It was unsustainable as it was. I mean, something had to happen. And a supervised injecting room facility is an obvious harm reduction measure. The facility offers a lot of support for people, mental health services, general practice services, long-acting injectable buprenorphine if they want to go down that track. We have a big homeless problem in that area of Melbourne. There's homelessness supports, employment support. Like, it's just it's the wraparound services, I think, that really value add to it. So no one's ever died in the facility. There've been thousands of overdoses, but no one's died. So there's been no mental health, brain issues, damage done with people left as they would be in my laneway if somebody didn't find them. So the benefits have been enormous for the community and for the people that use the drugs. I mean, I really love living there. I think it's one of those communities that there's a huge sense of social justice. I think, it wouldn't suit everybody, but it's a very mixed migrant community. There's people from every continent lives there. You never know what might happen next, and I love that. I love that you're alive, and the majority of people are very comfortable living there, and it's right close to the city. You have the best of both worlds. I think the richness of those cultural differences, the people that come there to use drugs and can walk away alive, and the benefits of all the arts and culture and sport and food and everything that it offers. So, yeah, I definitely think it's improved the area, and I'm very proud of what the community's been able to achieve.
So to wrap up then, Judy, in terms of your fellowship, so you're going across the world. So tell us a little bit like where you've been and actually what you are trying to find out more about, and ultimately how to then implement that back in Australia.
So I received a Winston Churchill fellowship to travel to 8 cities in 8 weeks. I've been to Vancouver and Toronto, New York, Paris, Zurich. Now I'm fortunate to be in Cardiff in Wales. Next week is Glasgow, then Dublin, and then home. So my project is to learn how drug-impacted communities engage governments to save lives using health-based solutions.
Cool.
So my interest really is, I'm not an academic and I'm not employed by anybody. I'm actually a volunteer, but I'm just really keen to know, how do communities across all these international cities engage their politicians to look at the evidence, speak to the people who are impacted in the communities, and make really sound public policy decisions? I just don't think they do. I think they really underestimate the support that people have for these facilities. They want something done, and even if their drive is just to get it off the street, of evidence of public injecting, that's fine. I just think I'm sort of pretty disappointed in our global politicians, really, in the main. I think they just, for something that has struck me in the last 6 weeks, drug addiction impacts so many people. Families know, and people know somebody, they love somebody, they've got a neighbour or a work friend. Addiction is not an unusual health issue. It's really common, sadly. It's because of the stigma. We just don't have a global policy or something that's practical to manage it. I mean, in terms of illicit substances, just going there as far as decriminalisation or just looking at some form of regulation of the current toxic drug supply just really concerns me. It sort of seems like a pretty obvious thing to look at. I mean, cannabis is obviously on the radar for a lot of countries, and that's great. I mean, I think about how alcohol used to be prohibited, but it's now been regulated for years. And I just wonder, what will it actually take for countries to really look at the incredible evidence that's been gathered? Now, clearly, I was in Switzerland last week. I mean, they were trailblazers there back in the 80s when they had the terrible opioid deaths. They decided to go out on a limb and do some extraordinary stuff. They're still doing it. And then others have followed as well. And I just, I look at what happened in Vancouver and in Toronto and in the US with regard to the OxyContin prescribing tragedy, crime. And the fallout of that has been to basically not address the addiction that came from that. And being in Vancouver was just a really tragic image in my life. It's such a beautiful city, and to think that is happening there is really challenging as a human being. So I was talking to a lead psychiatrist in Zurich last week, and he said that he was sick of treating people whose pain and suffering and health issues were impacted by unregulated substances. And he said, he really, that needs to change because people's health will improve. So I have learnt a lot of things. Language is really important. I've noted as well. People call the drug supply poisoned. Others call it unregulated, toxic. If somebody who isn't a regular user of drugs sadly dies of using toxic drugs, it's called drug poisoning. If somebody in the street dies of the same sort of drugs, it's called an overdose. So there's this really stigmatised language around people's use of drugs and what happens to them. There's a whole debate about recovery, whatever that means. Abstinence is still on the agenda in some countries. I've seen some really small, modest consumption rooms with 4 little booths in the back of a church that do extraordinary things and caring for people, especially going into prisons before people are released, to make sure they've got the support when they come out, because it's a very dangerous time when people come out of jail. They haven't been using for some time, and they can be, it can be a deadly time. I've been really touched by a lot of the compassion that people have for people in these situations, looking at early childhood trauma, what's happened in their lives to try and address these issues. It's been a remarkable time. I have pinched myself often thinking, how did I get here? But just being here today in Wales with this great support networks here in Kaleidoscope and Barrod, and what people are doing and aiming to do. And I think the other thing too is how the drug market does change, and how we almost need to be really constantly pivoting and looking at the different ways we can assist people with addiction, and how to and what they're doing in Zurich relating to the heroin assistance treatment, which is just pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
And acknowledging that people can live with addiction. You can have a really quality life if your addiction is managed. So it's not about abstinence necessarily or whatever recovery is, but really interesting ways of respecting that people might want to use drugs, but they can just do it safely and still live a functioning life is really impressive. So when I return to Australia, I'll have some ideas in terms of things that we haven't, well, they may have been thought about but not discussed in the broader conversation. But I really think that community engagement is really key. And the police are huge stakeholders, how the police as frontline workers and paramedics as well, to really get those voices coming together with a really respectful and evidence-based conversation to look at really good outcomes for our community is really important. Yeah, I mean, it's still a lot to think about, and but a great opportunity to speak with other extraordinary people that are doing wonderful things to save and change lives.
Yeah, it sounds like a great trip, and it sounds, yeah, a great bit of like research that you're doing, you know, in terms of, yeah, how to engage and how the politicians are engaging, and stuff like that. And yeah, going back to Vancouver, you know, I've been lucky enough to go to Vancouver, and yeah, it's an absolutely beautiful city. You know, it's one of my favourite I've been to. But I always remember going to downtown East Side where Insight is and some of the other supervised consumption sites, and it's an image that will just never leave me in terms of, you know, you literally just turn a corner and it's like another world really to a degree from there. Judy, the last question. Obviously Scotland, Glasgow is due to open up the UK's first consumption room, probably any day, any week now really. You know, and obviously it's something that we've discussed in Wales and the rest of the UK for quite some time. If and when it does happen, you know, in other parts of the UK, and you do have people in similar situations to yourself, for those people who would be very apprehensive or completely against it, is there kind of a message or two that you would kind of relay to try and alleviate some of those fears?
Look, well, it also depends on how a decision has been taken about where it's located, and also what sort of engagement has happened with those people. I must say, when it happened in our area, we weren't really consulted. At the end, it was really something that was kept, that we weren't included, which was disappointing at the time. So people weren't prepared. We weren't surprised where it was because, as I said, it was located near where the needle exchange was. But nevertheless, to have some sort of idea where it is and to prepare people and talk about the public amenity practices that will be implemented, which is really key as well, because the local council or local government area needs to be part of the story. So in terms of people in Glasgow, I mean, I'm assuming that where the facility is, there's been serious drug using for a long time. I think they should notice a big difference where there's somewhere for people to go. It'll take some while for everybody to get used to it, including the people who use drugs, the staff, and the police. It's a really, it's a monumental change in an area. I would suggest people just let it settle down for a few months to see how things pan out. There'll need to be probably amendments made to the way things are done, but ultimately to remember that people won't be dying in their streets from overdose, assuming they use the facility. Ambulance call-outs will reduce, so there won't be the really traumatic sound of sirens and access to properties, shops. But it just takes some time to really understand the benefits that it brings. And sure, the media will have a lot to say about it, but to be thoughtful about your receipt of the media. And this is where government and politicians should also have a big part to play in communicating. People who run the facility need to keep the community informed. They need to have tours, opportunity for people to learn how it works. There's a lot of work that happens. You just don't open them and then just go, job's done.
Yeah.
You need to work with people to bed it down in the community. But I just wish people all the best. I congratulate Scotland for doing this, and I know it will make a big difference to many people in a very good way.
Yeah, 100%. I think it will, definitely. Judy, thank you so much for joining us, taking the time out. Enjoy the rest of your travels, and I'm not jealous at all that you get to go back home to Melbourne as well. Beautiful, beautiful city.
And it will be spring there, so that's actually nice.
Yeah.
Which is good, yes. Yeah.
Lovely.
But thank you for asking me. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you, Rob.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Judy. Everyone else, we will see you soon. Bye-bye. If you have been affected by any of the issues discussed in today's podcast, please reach out. Barod have a free and confidential live web chat service that is available 7 days a week on our website at barod.cymru, where you can chat to a trained support worker. Alternatively, you can contact Wales's National Drug and Alcohol Helpline, Dan 24/7, either by calling 0808 808 2234 or text Dan to 81066.